right. The U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, concluded her 4-day visit to China today, telling reporters that she hopes to see some results in the next few months. Well, her message to American businesses was to continue investing in China, even after recognizing earlier how some companies are beginning to view China as uninvestable. So what can we draw from the trip? Well, joining me now to discuss this is China expert Gordon Chang. He's the distinguished fellow, senior fellow at the Gatestone Institute and the author of The Coming Collapse of China and the Great U.S.-China Tech War. You can follow him on social media on the former platform of Twitter under the handle of @GordonG.Chang. Gordon, welcome back to Washington Watch. Great to have you on the program.
Thank you so much, Jody.
Well, listen, as I mentioned just a moment ago, the Commerce Secretary is the latest Biden administration official to visit China here recently, hopefully to strengthen some communications between the two countries. But before we get into the actual visit, refresh our viewers and listeners, who else in the cabinet has recently been to China?
There have been 4 straight visits of senior Biden administration officials to Beijing without a return visit by a Chinese official. And it started in June with Secretary of State Antony Blinken. It continued with that infamous visit of Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. John Kerry, the climate czar, was next. And now it's been Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary. And the problem here is that we are giving the Chinese the impression that we ourselves believe that we are supplicants to China, because this is unprecedented in the straight visits to Beijing without a return visit.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we're communicating. What do you think this administration is trying to do with all these visits?
I actually don't know, because what these visits do is it makes it harder for the administration to accomplish its own goals, because they're making the Chinese more arrogant. There are two things I can guess. One of them is that, as we know, Secretary Blinken talks a lot to Henry Kissinger. They basically live in the same building. And so, Kissinger has been warning about war. In June, he said that war between China and the United States over Taiwan is, quote unquote, probable. And so I guess the Biden team is trying to desperately prevent a war. But what they're doing is actually accelerating it by making the Chinese even more emboldened. The other thing is that maybe the Commerce Secretary knows that American business is going to leave China anyway, so she doesn't want to say, oh, you should leave China, because she doesn't want to be blamed for the severing of relations. And so she's saying, oh, yeah, invest in China. The problem there, Jody, is that China is increasingly dangerous for American business and Americans and foreigners in general. And as a matter of protecting Americans, she should be urging American businesses to get out of China as fast as possible. We have seen this before in Chinese history, where they attack foreigners, and that's exactly what's going on right now.
Excellent point. And, the Commerce Secretary said there was no compromise, and yet there were 27 Chinese companies on our blacklist who have been taken off that list in relation to this tour, this visit by the Commerce Secretary. Can you tell us about that? So we have these 27 companies taken off the blacklist, but what did we get, if anything, in return?
The only thing that we got, Jody, was, I suppose, the right for Secretary Raimondo to go to Beijing. I think this probably was a condition that the Chinese imposed, taking the 27 companies off the unverified list of the Commerce Department. But this is really wrong. If you're going to make a concession, you should get a concession at the same time. Sending the Commerce Secretary to Beijing should not be viewed as a concession, because right now China needs us much more than we need China, because the American economy is chugging along. I mean, there are problems, of course, but we're chugging along. And China is falling apart. And so they need foreign business. They need American business. And so we've given them a big favor and gotten nothing in return.
Well, it's so frustrating. Do you have any idea what other things of substance were discussed during the meeting?
They probably, we know that they set up these bilateral forums on discussing America's national security restrictions on Chinese companies, sort of explaining them. Well, we shouldn't be explaining our rules to the Chinese. They can read. They can read very well. They go to Harvard. They go to Cambridge. They go to Oxford. They can read. The other thing is that there was the issue about tourism, about encouraging Americans to go to China and Chinese to come to the United States. But what we're doing by sending tourists to China is just increasing the number of potential hostages, because China has been taking hostages, including Americans. And I'm sure the other thing that they talked about was China not taking deliveries of 737 MAXs. So it's a Boeing issue there as well. The refusal to take those planes is unjustified, another Chinese trade violation. And instead of talking about this, we should be imposing costs for unjustifiable Chinese behavior. Let's give the Chinese something to talk about. Now, I don't think we should be talking to China anyway for a lot of reasons. That's a very involved conversation. But if you think we should be talking to China, and the Biden administration obviously does, then at least make it possible to have a meaningful conversation. You know, over these 4 trips, there have been virtually no meaningful conversations with the Chinese as far as we can tell.
Gordon, listen, we've only got about a minute or so left. And I know the Shanghai Communist Party secretary said that he wants a stable relationship between the United States and China. And they're also wanting some sort of rational and practical policies. 30 seconds or so, what do you think they mean by that?
They mean the end of all American defensive measures. Essentially, they want concessions from us. They don't want to give us anything. And so, yeah, that sounds nice. But if there's instability in the relationship, and there certainly is, it's because of China, not because of the United States.
Well, it's a very interesting scenario, and it can be a frightening scenario that's unfolding before us. Gordon Chang, thank you so much for your insight on all of this. Thank you for joining us on Washington Watch.
Thank you, Jody.